I never believed my grandmother's stories until I held her journal in my hands, ink-stained and trembling, 3 days after we buried her in the mountain soil she loved. My twin sister Emma found it first, wedged beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin where we'd spent our childhood summers, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of cedar and something else, something wild and indefinable that made my throat tighten with a memory I couldn't name. The cabin sat exactly as grandmother left it, her teacup still on the windowsill, her reading glasses folded beside the rocking chair that faced the darkening tree line, as if she'd simply stepped outside and forgotten to return. We'd come to settle her estate, to sort through a lifetime of accumulated things. But what we found instead was a confession written in her careful script, pages filled with warnings about something she called the old mourner in the hollow, a phrase that carried weight like stones dropped into deep water. The entries weren't dated in any conventional way, marked instead by seasons and signs, by the blooming of bloodroot and the turning of leaves, by patterns in nature that she'd observed with the attention of someone reading sacred text. Between the pages, pressed flowers crumbled at our touch, releasing scents that transported us backward through time, to moments we'd forgotten, to whispered conversations at dusk, and her gentle insistence that we learn words in a dialect she claimed was older than the mountains themselves. Some passages were heavily crossed out, others written so urgently the pen had torn through the paper, and there were sketches in the margins, crude drawings of massive handprints beside human ones for scale, of trees marked with symbols we recognized from stones around the property. On the final written page, she'd drawn a map with landmarks we knew, the old lightning-struck oak and the creek that sang different songs depending on the season, but the path continued beyond anywhere we'd ever ventured, winding deep into forest we'd been forbidden to explore. The map ended at a hollow marked with a single word, written 3 times, each iteration more desperate than the last, a name or title we couldn't pronounce, but that seemed to pulse with significance in the dimming cabin light. At the bottom of the page, in letters so faint we almost missed them, she'd written, "If you're reading this, the watching has ended, and the wait passes to you." We looked at each other across the table, scattered with her belongings, and I saw in Emma's eyes the same thing I felt rising in my chest, grief mixing with something more primal, a curiosity that felt less like choice and more like calling. The next morning we stood at the cabin's edge, with the journal open between us, the map creased from our study, our packs loaded with supplies, for what we told ourselves would be a simple hike to honor her memory. The forest breathed around us in the pre-dawn stillness, mist threading through the trees, like something alive and purposeful, carrying that same unnameable scent from the oilcloth, stronger now, almost beckoning. Emma touched the first symbol carved into a nearby tree, her fingers tracing the weathered grooves, and I watched her face change as recognition flickered across it, the same symbol from the stones we'd played among as children, marks we'd assumed were natural or decorative. Neither of us spoke about why we were really going, about the pull we both felt radiating from those pages, from grandmother's final mystery, offered like an inheritance we couldn't refuse. The path existed exactly where she'd drawn it, not a trail, but a way through that revealed itself only when we knew to look for it, marked by subtle signs that seemed to glow with intention once we understood their language. We walked in silence, broken only by our footsteps and the morning birds, but there was a conversation happening beneath words, between twins who'd always shared an unspoken understanding, an acknowledgement that we were crossing a threshold into something that would demand more from us than simple belief. The deeper we went, the more the forest changed. Trees growing larger and older, the canopy thickening until the light turned green and ancient, filtering down like we'd descended into depths that counted time differently than the world we'd left behind. I felt grandmother walking with us somehow, her presence in every symbol that guided our way, in the words of that strange dialect rising. Unbidden in my memory, in the certainty that we were being led not just through the woods, but through a door she'd kept locked until her death finally turned the key. Behind us, the familiar world grew distant and dreamlike, and ahead, the hollow waited with its secrets and its sorrows, with answers to questions we were only beginning to know how to ask. Something vast and sorrowful was pulling us forward, had been pulling us since before we found the journal, perhaps since before we were born, a gravity that felt like destiny disguised as choice. The silence found us before we found the hollow, a suffocating absence that pressed against our eardrums like physical weight, as if the forest had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. Emma noticed it first, stopping mid-stride with her hand raised in warning, her head tilted in that listening posture we'd shared since childhood, and I realized with creeping unease that nothing sang or chirped or rustled, that even our footsteps seemed swallowed by an acoustic void that defied nature. The birds had abandoned this place, or been dismissed from it, and the insects that should have hummed in the undergrowth were simply gone, leaving behind a vacuum that made my own heartbeat sound obscenely loud in my chest. We stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, straining for any sound of life, finding instead only our breathing and the occasional creak of massive trees swaying, though no wind touched our skin. Above us, far higher than seemed possible, thick branches were snapped and twisted at angles that suggested tremendous force applied with terrible precision, breaks that revealed pale wood underneath like exposed bone, some fresh and others weathered grey by seasons of exposure. I craned my neck backward, trying to calculate what could reach those heights, what would need to, and found no answer that fit within the boundaries of the world I thought I knew. The damage formed patterns when viewed together, deliberate pathways through the canopy that something had carved for reasons beyond my comprehension, and I felt Emma's hand find mine, her grip tight with the same dawning awareness that we were reading evidence of intention, of intelligence moving through this space with purpose. That smell hit us then, rolling down the hollow, in an invisible wave that bypassed thought and struck directly into memory's deepest chamber, ancient and organic and profoundly alive, carrying notes of earth and musk and something ceremonial, like incense burned in forgotten temples. My grandmother's voice echoed unbidden in my mind, her stories told by firelight about things that walked between the worlds, and I understood with sudden clarity that she hadn't been speaking in metaphor. The forest floor changed as we descended, the normal chaos of leaves and fallen branches giving way to something that resembled order, stones arranged in configurations that might have been random but felt weighted with meaning, forming boundaries or markers we couldn't quite decipher. Emma knelt beside one arrangement, her fingers hovering, without touching, and whispered that she remembered grandmother placing stones like this around the cabin. Protective patterns, she'd called them, old mountain ways that predated any religion we'd been taught. The trees here were different too, older than old, their bark scarred with symbols that matched those in the journal, carved deep enough that decades of growth hadn't erased them, a language written in living wood that spoke of agreements and boundaries respected across generations. I photographed them with shaking hands, knowing even as I did that the images would fail to capture what we were experiencing, that some truths resisted translation into the digital realm, demanding, instead, to be witnessed with eyes that had walked this path and earned the seeing. The air grew thicker as we moved deeper, pressing against us with almost liquid resistance, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid the overwhelming intensity of that smell, which had shifted from ancient to immediate, from memory to presence. Something had been here recently, or was here still, massive and careful and aware of our intrusion into its territory, its sanctuary, its grief. That last thought arrived fully formed, unquestioned, as if planted directly into my consciousness by the hollow itself, and I saw Emma's face pale as the same realization struck her simultaneously. We were not alone, had not been alone since we'd crossed into the silence, and whatever watched us from the spaces between trees carried a sorrow so vast it had soaked into the soil and air itself, transforming this place into a cathedral of loss, where even the light fell differently, reverent and subdued. The smell triggered something buried deep in childhood, a night I'd forgotten or been made to forget. Emma and I, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, waking to grandmother's urgent whispers as she carried us to the window, her finger pointing toward the tree line, where something enormous moved between the pines, its shape too large and too coordinated to be shadow or imagination. She'd held us. Close and spoken words in that old dialect, her voice steady and respectful, not afraid but reverent, and the thing in the darkness had stopped, had turned toward the cabin with a deliberation that suggested it understood, that it was answering a greeting from an old friend. The memory returned with such force I stumbled, catching myself against a tree whose bark was warm to the touch, despite the coolness of the deep forest. And I met Emma's wide eyes, and knew she was remembering too, that the forgetting hadn't been complete, only waiting for this moment to release its hold. We'd seen it before, or something like it, and grandmother had wanted us to see, had been preparing us even then for an inheritance we were only now beginning to comprehend. The path opened suddenly into the hollow proper, a bowl carved into the mountainside that felt less discovered than revealed, as if it had decided to show itself only when it judged us ready, and there in the center, impossible to miss and somehow easy to overlook, lay the pit that matched. The final page of the journal. Everything we'd experienced, the silence and the breaks and the smell and the watching, had been leading us here, to this place where the boundaries between story and truth dissolved like morning mist under a sun that seemed reluctant to fully illuminate what rested below. We stood at the edge, hands still clasped, breathing in unison as we had in the womb, preparing to look down into whatever mystery our grandmother had spent her life protecting, whatever ancient mourner had claimed this hollow as its final resting place. The pit descended perhaps 15 feet, its walls carved with the precision of intention rather than erosion, lined with stones that had been selected and placed according to principles that predated engineering as we understood it. But it was the contents that stopped my breath entirely, a collection so impossible in its juxtaposition that my mind initially refused to process what my eyes reported, rejecting the evidence as some trick of shadow or exhaustion-induced hallucination. Objects from different centuries lay arranged in concentric circles, each ring telling a story my rational mind struggled to accept. A rusted musket alongside a plastic doll from the 1980s, both positioned with identical care. Hand-forged nails from colonial settlements next to a faded Polaroid photograph, fragments of pottery that might have been Cherokee or older still, their surfaces touching a tarnished pocket watch whose hands had stopped at 3:17. Emma's grip on my hand tightened until her nails dug crescents into my palm, an anchor of shared reality that confirmed I wasn't hallucinating, that she saw it too, this museum of human moments curated by something that had witnessed our species moving through these mountains across generations. The arrangement wasn't random or chaotic, but deliberately composed, each object speaking to others in a language of placement and proximity, forming a narrative we could feel even if we couldn't fully read it, a timeline of contact and connection that stretched back, further than any official history acknowledged. Among the human artifacts lay bones, hundreds of them, positioned with the same reverence archaeologists might show to royal tombs. But these weren't human remains. Deer skulls formed a protective circle around the pit's perimeter, their antlers interlocking like clasped hands or a crown of thorns, while smaller bones, bird and rabbit and squirrel, were arranged in patterns that resembled constellations or maps of territories we'd never learned existed. Nothing about their placement suggested violence or predation. Instead, each skeleton component had been honored as if commemorating a life witnessed, a death acknowledged. The mountains creatures given equal reverence to the human objects they surrounded. I thought of grandmother's stories about animals that came to her door in their final moments, seeking her presence as they passed, and how she'd sit with them until the end, speaking softly in that old dialect, performing what she'd called the farewell ceremony. Had she learned it from the keeper, or had he learned it from her ancestors? And how many generations had this exchange of rituals and respect been flowing between human and something other? The bones gleamed white in the filtered light, cleaned and preserved with care that spoke of love, or something adjacent to love, a devotion that transcended species, boundaries, and touched something more fundamental about the recognition of life itself. Fresh wildflowers crowned the entire arrangement, impossibly vibrant against the earthen backdrop, blooms that shouldn't survive in the pit's shade, yet thrived there, as if sustained by forces beyond photosynthesis. Mountain laurel and rhododendron, their pink and white petals fully open, formed garlands that wove between the artifacts and bones, while trillium, rare and protected, carpeted the spaces between with their three-petaled perfection. They weren't wilting or browning at the edges, but seemed to exist in a state of perpetual bloom, as fresh as if picked that morning, though the pit's construction clearly predated recent days. Emma released my hand to wipe tears I hadn't realized she was shedding, her voice breaking as she whispered that grandmother had taught us the meanings of mountain flowers, that trillium meant return and remembrance, that rhododendron spoke of survival and warning, that laurel crowned those who had earned respect through sacrifice. This was a language we'd been taught to read without knowing why, a vocabulary our grandmother had embedded in childhood nature walks and garden lessons, preparing us to understand this exact message when we finally stood in this hollow and read what had been written. The flowers weren't decoration, but communication, a statement in botanical grammar that declared this place sacred, this figure worthy of honor, this loss significant enough to bend the rules of nature itself in its commemoration. At the pit's center, partially buried as if the earth had tried to embrace it or hide it or become indistinguishable from it, lay a shape my eyes kept sliding away from. Too large to properly process, covered in fur that might have been black or brown or something between, matted with soil and preserved by processes I couldn't begin to guess. One enormous hand extended from the mass, fingers as thick as my forearm, nails like dark horn, the palm facing upward in a gesture that read as both offering and supplication, and clutched in that massive grip was something small and metallic that caught the light with familiar gleam. A locket, delicate and human-scaled, absurdly tiny against those impossible fingers, held with a gentleness that shattered something in my chest and rebuilt it into a shape that could contain this new understanding. Emma was already climbing down, using the arranged stones as steps, moving toward that hand, with the inevitability of someone fulfilling a purpose they'd been born to complete, and I followed, because we had always followed each other into every unknown, because whatever transformation awaited us in that pit required both witnesses, both grandchildren, both keepers of a story we were only beginning to comprehend. The locket opened with a whisper of aged hinges, its interior revealing a photograph so faded it seemed to exist more as impression than image. Two figures standing before this very hollow in what must have been the 1940s based on grandmother's dress and the eternal youth still present in her face. She stood perhaps 20 years old, her hand extended towards something the camera had captured only as blur and shadow, a towering shape that the photograph's chemistry had refused to fully record, as if the film itself had recoiled from rendering what stood beside her in complete detail. But the posture of both figures spoke, clearly across the decades, her stance relaxed and trusting, the massive form leaning slightly downward in what could only be read as protective attention. Two beings sharing space with the ease of long familiarity rather than the tension of first encounter. Emma's hands trembled as she held this evidence of impossible friendship, tears falling onto the tarnished silver, and I felt my own vision blur as childhood memories suddenly reorganized themselves around this new context. Moments I'd dismissed as imagination, now revealed as glimpses of truth our young minds had witnessed but couldn't properly categorize or retain. The creature's hand still held the locket with such gentleness that I understood this hadn't been taken or found, but given, entrusted to him by our grandmother as token or promise, carried perhaps through years or decades, until whatever end had brought him to this burial position. I knelt beside that massive palm and slowly, with reverence that felt more instinct than decision, placed my own hand against one of those enormous fingers, feeling beneath the fur and earth the density of ancient bone, the absolute stillness of death, but also something else. A warmth that shouldn't exist yet did, as if the stones and soil around him had absorbed his essence and continued radiating it back in defiance of decomposition's usual timeline. Emma mirrored my gesture. On the opposite side, and the moment we both made contact, something shifted in the air itself, a pressure change or frequency that I felt in my chest rather than heard, like the first note of a song played in a register below human hearing, but still somehow perceived. The arranged objects around us seemed to pulse with significance, each artifact, suddenly more than mere collection, each bone and flower and human remnant becoming a word in a sentence we were finally learning to read, a testament written in the grammar of memory and witness. In that contact, I felt them, not as vision, but as knowing. Moments flooding through our touching hands, as if the creature's final act had been to preserve these memories in his very cells, offering them to whoever would eventually understand enough to reach out and receive. I saw grandmother as a child, lost in a winter storm, and massive footprints appearing to guide her home. Prints she'd followed with absolute trust because she'd somehow already known what made them and understood it. Meant protection rather than threat. I felt the creature standing watch during the influenza epidemic of 1918, bringing herbs to doorsteps in the deepest night, leaving remedies made from mountain plants according to knowledge that predated European arrival by centuries uncounted. I witnessed him pulling a trapped miner from a collapsed shaft, the man's descendants still living in these mountains, never knowing what strength had moved those impossible boulders while rescuers worked from the other side. Each memory carried emotional weight that transcended species difference, revealing a consciousness that understood human fragility and chose gentleness that witnessed our brief lives with something approaching sorrow for their brevity, that had made protecting our family line his purpose across generations for reasons the memories didn't explain, but his devotion made unnecessary to question. Emma gasped, and I knew she felt them too, these inherited memories transferring through touch and intention, his final gift ensuring the story wouldn't die with him, that witnesses would carry forward what he'd been and what he'd done, and why the old ways mattered enough to keep. When we finally lifted our hands, the warmth faded, but the knowing remained, permanent as bone-deep truth, and we understood that grandmother's journal hadn't been warning but invitation. Her map not cautionary but inheritance, leading us here so we could receive what the keeper had preserved, until the right witnesses arrived to continue the covenant he'd honored, until his final breath still tasted of mountain laurel and ancient, unshakable devotion. We read grandmother's journal by the pit's edge as afternoon light slanted. Through the canopy, Emma's voice steady, despite trembling hands, as she spoke the words our ancestor had written across decades of communion with what shouldn't exist yet did. The earliest entries dated back to 1937, when grandmother was just 9 years old and had wandered too far, chasing a wounded rabbit, finding herself at the edge of this same hollow as darkness gathered and wolves began their evening chorus. She'd written in careful script about the silence that fell then, how the wolf song stopped mid-note as if cut by a blade, and the massive shape that emerged from the tree line moving with impossible quietness for something so large, positioning itself between her small body, and the circling pack with deliberate protective intent. The creatures had retreated without challenge, recognizing hierarchy or power that transcended predator instinct, and the keeper had knelt before her, she wrote, lowering his enormous head in greeting or perhaps assessment, his eyes holding intelligence that frightened her less than the wolves had, because it was intelligence that chose mercy, that understood childhood fear and deliberately gentled itself in response. He'd walked her home that night, staying always at the forest's edge, where moonlight couldn't fully illuminate his form, and at her family's property line he'd pressed into her hand a river stone worn smooth, a silk, a token or seal that she somehow understood meant protection, covenant, a bond that would extend beyond that single rescue into something larger and more lasting than either of them could then comprehend. The entries continued through her adolescence with growing understanding, meetings in the hollow that became ritual, where she brought offerings the journal specified with careful detail, bread baked according to her grandmother's old country recipe, honey from wild hives, tobacco tied with red thread the way Cherokee neighbors had taught her family generations back, remembrances of traditions that the modern world was rapidly forgetting. The keeper received these gifts with what she described as profound gravity, arranging them among the stones with ceremonial precision, and in return he taught her things that had no name in any language she knew, how to read weather patterns in the way birds flew 3 days before storms arrived, which plants could heal and which could harm, and how the difference sometimes lay only in preparation and intent, the locations of springs that never froze even in the deepest winter, where animals gathered on neutral ground in times of desperation. But more than practical knowledge, she wrote, he taught her witnessing, the sacred importance of attention, of noticing what the world was losing as progress devoured memory, of remembering, on behalf of all the forgotten things that had once made these mountains holy ground, rather than merely real estate awaiting development. Their meetings became vigils for dying ways, two beings from different species united in grief for what human advancement destroyed without understanding what it sacrificed. And I felt Emma's voice crack as she read our grandmother's admission that she loved him, not as one loves a pet or even a friend, but as one loves a guardian angel who manifests as flesh and bone rather than ethereal spirit, whose protection costs him isolation, and whose devotion demands secrecy that ensures loneliness. The journal's tone shifted after 1963. Entries growing shorter and weighted with sorrow as grandmother wrote about noticing the keeper's aging, how he moved with less ease, how his breathing sometimes labored after long climbs, how his eyes carried accumulated sadness that seemed to physically burden him as decades of witness compressed into weariness that even his massive frame couldn't indefinitely bear. She'd asked him once, she wrote, if there were others of his kind, and the silence that followed her question had lasted so long, she'd feared offense, until he'd finally placed one enormous hand over his chest and then opened his palm to the empty forest, a gesture she understood meant he was alone, the last that whatever community or culture had produced him had diminished to this single remainder. And his choice to watch over humans was perhaps also a choice against dying entirely unwitnessed, without anyone to mark his passing or remember his name. The revelation had broken something in her, she confessed in handwriting that grew ragged with emotion, understanding that she was friend but also burden, that her family's need for protection had bound him to loneliness, that the covenant between them was simultaneously sacred and tragic, a relationship that gave his isolation purpose, but also ensured he could never seek his own kind, even if others survived somewhere beyond these mountains. She'd wept in his presence that day, she wrote, and he'd gathered her against his chest with heartbreaking gentleness, two beings mourning together for losses that transcended individual grief and touched something universal about devotion, duty, and the terrible price of choosing to remain when everything else has moved on. The final entries chronicled the last 5 years of their relationship, Grandmother's handwriting growing shakier as both she and the keeper moved toward inevitable endings that their bond could delay but not prevent. She wrote about finding him collapsed near the pit one autumn morning in 2018, his breathing shallow and his massive body trembling with effort even at rest, and how she'd stayed with him for 3 days and nights, bringing water and food he couldn't eat, speaking to him in the old mountain dialect she'd researched for years, specifically so they'd share a language that predated the modern world's intrusion. He'd recovered enough to resume his wandering, but the pattern repeated with increasing frequency, his territory shrinking as his strength diminished until their meetings shifted from ritual gathering to something closer to hospice visitation, Grandmother bearing witness to a dying species with the reverence of attending a saint's final days. She documented his preparation with anthropological precision touched by profound love, how he began arranging objects in the pit with deliberate intent, positioning each artifact to tell stories that would otherwise die with him, creating an archaeological record of his interventions across centuries of human habitation in these mountains. The locket, containing her photograph, had been his final addition, placed with shaking hands just weeks before her own death, and she'd understood it meant his time was approaching, that he was completing his memorial before lying down in it, choosing to be buried in evidence of the lives he'd touched, rather than dying alone and unmourned in some hidden cave where weather and scavengers would erase all proof of his existence. But the revelation that fractured my understanding came in an entry dated just 3 months before Grandmother passed, written in handwriting so faint we had to tilt the journal toward the fading light to read it. She'd asked the keeper during one of their final visits if he had regrets, if the covenant with her family had been worth the cost of his isolation, and his response had reshaped everything I thought I understood about their relationship. He'd taken her hand, she wrote, and pressed it against objects in the pit one by one, and with each touch she'd received not visions, but feelings, emotional impressions that bypassed language and communicated directly. Through contact and intention, the carved wooden horse from the 1800s carried the relief of a child found alive after 3 days lost in winter woods, returned to frantic parents who never knew what massive shape had sheltered their daughter in a cave and kept her warm with its own body heat. The tarnished compass from the Civil War era held gratitude from a wounded soldier guided to a Union camp, rather than left to bleed out in Confederate territory, delivered to safety by something he later told his family had been a bear walking upright in fever dreams, but whose eyes he'd never forgotten, eyes that held human compassion in an inhuman face. The wedding ring from 1942 resonated with joy from a young husband who'd survived a mining collapse because something had pulled him backward just before the tunnel caved. Strength in that rescue beyond anything human, but gentleness in how it carried him to the surface that made him certain he'd encountered not a monster, but a miracle in fur and flesh. That asked nothing but his silence about what had saved him. Emma's voice broke completely reading the next passage, and I took the journal with hands that shook worse than hers had. Grandmother wrote that she'd finally understood the keeper didn't see his life as tragedy but as purpose, that loneliness was the price he paid willingly for the privilege of mattering, of making differences that rippled through generations, even when those he saved never knew his name. The covenant wasn't a burden he'd accepted reluctantly, but a calling he'd chosen deliberately, and his only real fear wasn't dying alone, but dying unremembered. His interventions attributed to luck or providence or hallucination, rather than to the conscious choice of a being who'd decided human lives were worth protecting, even when humans might destroy him if they saw him clearly. He'd created the pit as testimony, she wrote, arranging evidence across centuries because he needed to believe that someday someone would find it and understand that he'd existed. that his species' final representative had spent his last decades guarding creatures who'd driven his kind into extinction, and that this choice represented not defeat, but something closer to forgiveness, or perhaps hope that witness and remembrance could redeem the violence of forgetting. She'd promised him that night, her final promise to her oldest friend, that she'd ensure someone would find him, that she'd leave instructions for her grandchildren because we'd been raised on the stories she'd disguised as fairy tales, taught the old words she'd claimed were just family traditions, prepared without knowing it to inherit a guardianship that transcended ordinary inheritance. The last entry was dated 2 days before grandmother's death, a single line written in handwriting that wandered across the page with the weakness of approaching endings. I told him you would come, that you would understand, that the story wouldn't die with us. Please prove me right. The words sat heavy as stones in my chest because I realized this entire journey had been orchestrated, that grandmother had mapped our path to this pit with the precision of someone ensuring that testimony would survive, that the keeper's memorial wouldn't remain undiscovered and meaningless, but would be witnessed by family who'd been unknowingly trained for exactly this moment. We weren't intruders stumbling onto something hidden, but invited guests arriving at an appointed time. And the grief I felt wasn't just for grandmother's loss, but for the staggering responsibility she'd passed to us. The weight of being chosen to carry forward a story that would sound insane if spoken aloud, but felt more true than anything I'd ever known. Sitting in that hollow, with evidence of impossible devotion arranged around us like relics in a cathedral, built from earth and time and love, too vast to be contained by a single species' understanding of what love could mean, or what forms it might choose to inhabit. We decided to camp near the pit that night, a choice that felt less like decision and more like inevitability, as though leaving would have been impossible even if we'd wanted to. Emma gathered firewood, while I cleared a space for our tent, both of us moving with unusual silence, the journal's revelations still settling into our understanding like sediment drifting to the bottom of disturbed water. The forest around us had changed since we'd arrived, or perhaps we'd changed in how we perceived it. Every shadow now potentially significant, every distant sound a possible communication rather than random noise. As darkness gathered between the trees, I felt the weight of being watched intensify until it became almost physical, pressure against my skin like standing too close to something massive, and warm, breathing slowly in the gathering night. Emma felt it too. I could tell by how she kept turning toward the forest's edge, her movements careful and deliberate, as though she understood we were no longer alone, and that whatever shared this hollow with us was measuring our worthiness, deciding if grandmother's faith in us had been justified or misplaced. The fire we built seemed too bright, too modern, an intrusion of contemporary light into a place where older rules applied, but we needed it as much for comfort as illumination, a circle of familiar warmth in territory that belonged to mystery and loss and things that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The first wood knock came an hour after sunset, a sharp crack of impact against a tree trunk somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight, deliberate and unmistakable as speech. Emma's hand found mine across the fire, her grip tight enough to hurt, both of us frozen in that moment of recognition that something was actively acknowledging our presence, responding to us with intention and awareness. I knocked back without thinking, rapping my knuckles against the log I'd been sitting on, 3 measured strikes that felt foolish and profound simultaneously, a gesture that might mean nothing or might mean everything depending on what listened in the darkness. The silence that followed stretched so long I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole exchange when an answer came. 3 measured knocks from a different direction, closer this time, the sound resonating through the hollow with a depth that suggested the striker was using something far larger than human hands on a tree, far more massive than anything near our camp. We knocked and listened, knocked and listened, establishing a pattern that felt like the earliest form of conversation. Communication stripped to its most essential elements, presence confirming presence across the boundary between known and unknown. The exchange continued for nearly an hour, the unseen respondent circling our camp at a consistent distance, never approaching but never leaving, maintaining contact through those measured strikes that gradually stopped feeling alien and started feeling almost companionable, the rhythm of someone keeping vigil rather than stalking prey. Dawn brought gifts we discovered only when leaving the tent, for morning light revealed them, stacks of flat stones arranged in careful cairns at 4 points around our camp, each pile precisely balanced in ways that suggested both considerable time and remarkable dexterity from whatever had built them. The stones were marked with scratches that might have been random or might have been symbols, patterns that almost suggested meaning, without quite resolving into anything I could name or categorize. Emma photographed them from every angle while I examined the ground around each cairn, finding impressions in the soft earth that my mind struggled to interpret, depressions too large and oddly proportioned to be human, but too deliberately placed to be animal, marks that suggested someone or something had knelt here in darkness, working with stone and intention while we slept unaware just yards away. The violation I should have felt never materialized, replaced instead by something closer to awe, the recognition that we'd been granted trust rather than threat, that whatever had circled our camp in darkness had chosen construction over destruction, communication over intimidation. The cairns felt like acceptance, acknowledgement that we belonged here, that grandmother had been right about us and her faith had been recognized by whatever presence continued her covenant, watching from forest shadows to see if her grandchildren would honor what she'd spent her lifetime protecting. By the second night, I'd stopped flinching at every sound and started listening with different ears, passing the forest's voice for patterns that distinguished random settling from deliberate signal, wind through branches from something massive moving with surprising care through dense undergrowth. The sensation of being watched had transformed from unsettling to oddly comforting. Presence becoming companionship, the knowledge that we weren't alone, shifting from threat to protection, as though whatever observed us had decided we were worth guarding rather than driving away. Emma felt it too, her tension gradually releasing, until she moved through our camp with something approaching ease, speaking in normal tones rather than whispers, existing in this liminal space between worlds, as though she'd been born to it. And perhaps in some sense we both had, raised on grandmother's stories and old words, prepared across decades for exactly this inheritance. The wood knocks continued at intervals throughout the day, sometimes answering our movements, sometimes initiating contact, establishing a dialogue without words that communicated more through rhythm and timing than any language built from syntax could have managed, and I found myself responding automatically, knocking back acknowledgement and gratitude, maintaining connection with something I couldn't see but increasingly trusted. Faith, built not from belief but from accumulating evidence that we were participants in something profound, rather than victims of something dangerous. The third night brought rain, soft at first, then building to a steady drumming against our tent that should have masked all other sounds but somehow didn't, as though the forest's voice had learned to speak through water and wind rather than being silenced by them. Emma had fallen asleep with the journal clutched against her chest, exhausted by 2 days of vigil and revelation, but I remained awake, listening to rhythms in the darkness that felt increasingly like language I was learning to comprehend without translation. Around midnight, the rain stopped with unnatural abruptness, silence rushing in to fill the void so completely that I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast and entirely too fragile for what I suddenly knew was about to happen. I left the tent without conscious decision, drawn by instinct or calling or simple inevitability toward the burial pit, my headlamp off. Because somehow I understood that artificial light would be intrusion, that what waited in the darkness required me to meet it on terms other than my own. The pit glowed faintly with bioluminescent fungi I hadn't noticed in daylight, soft green radiance that illuminated without revealing, casting everything in dreamlike unreality that made the massive shape standing at the pit's edge seem both impossible and utterly natural. As though my mind had been preparing for this moment across every story grandmother had ever told, every old word she'd insisted we learn, every warning about respecting what lived in deep places where human certainty dissolved into older truths. The creature stood, motionless as a standing stone, towering at least 9 feet tall, with proportions that suggested human ancestry filtered through centuries of divergent evolution. Broad shoulders supporting a head that seemed too large and oddly shaped in the dim light, covered in dark hair that merged with shadows until I couldn't determine where body ended and darkness began. Its eyes caught the faint luminescence and reflected it back, not with animal eyeshine, but with something more complex, depth and awareness and profound sorrow that hit me like physical force, grief so ancient and absolute that my own losses felt like shallow imitations in comparison. The creature was looking into the pit, long, arms hanging at its sides, hands that seemed too large and too delicate simultaneously, fingers that could crush stone, but currently held only empty air and the weight of incomprehensible mourning. I understood without words that I was witnessing sacred ritual, the last of its kind, honoring the one who had chosen humanity over isolation, who had broken covenant with his own people to watch over ours, who had loved my grandmother with devotion that transcended species and circumstance and the vast loneliness of being singular. The creature began to sway, subtle movement that gradually intensified into rhythmic motion, arms rising and falling in patterns that felt ceremonial, ancient, a language of gesture and intention that my rational mind couldn't pass, but some deeper recognition understood as prayer or eulogy or grief made physical. I should have been terrified, but found instead a sorrow so overwhelming it drove me to my knees at the pit's opposite edge, tears streaming down my face for losses I'd never experienced personally, but suddenly felt with devastating clarity, centuries of watching and protecting and loving from necessary distance, touching human lives only in moments of crisis or need, collecting their artifacts like precious relics because objects were all that remained after the people themselves had crumbled into the same earth that would eventually claim everything. The creature's movements became more elaborate, hands weaving patterns in the air above the pit, and I realized it was asking something of me, requesting witness or participation or acknowledgement that this moment mattered, that what lay buried here had significance beyond the physical, that remembering was itself a form of resurrection, keeping alive what would otherwise dissolve completely into forgotten mystery. Grandmother's words rose in my memory unbidden, the old dialect she'd taught us through songs and stories, phrases I'd thought were nonsense or corrupted English, but now recognized as something far more ancient, a language that predated modern speech and carried meanings too complex for contemporary words to contain. I spoke them aloud, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, reciting the passages she'd marked in her journal, prayers or promises or covenant renewals, my voice joining with the creature's movements in ceremony that felt like completing a circuit, closing a loop that had remained open since grandmother's passing, providing the witness that honored both the watcher and the watched. The creature responded to my words with a sound I felt more than heard, a resonance that vibrated through my chest and settled into my bones, recognition and gratitude and profound relief that someone still spoke the old language, still honored the old ways, still acknowledged that mysteries deserved reverence rather than explanation. It continued its ritual movements while I spoke everything grandmother had written, every phrase in that ancient tongue, feeling meaning flow through me without complete intellectual comprehension, understanding occurring at levels beneath conscious thought, knowledge passing through witness and participation rather than study or analysis. When I finally finished, voice raw and tears still flowing, the creature became perfectly still, arms spread wide above the pit in a gesture that seemed to embrace or bless or release, holding that position so long I thought it might have, transformed into actual stone, until finally, slowly, it lowered its arms and turned its gaze directly toward me. We looked at each other across the pit and across the vast distance between our kinds, recognition passing between us that felt like inheritance being acknowledged, responsibility being transferred, covenant being renewed for another generation. And in that moment I understood that grandmother hadn't just told me stories, but had prepared me across my entire lifetime for exactly this threshold, this transformation from skeptic to witness, from inheritor to guardian. The creature gestured toward the pit with one massive hand, then to the objects scattered around its edge, a clear invitation that required no translation because I felt grandmother's presence so strongly in that moment, her hands guiding mine as they had when she taught me to arrange flowers or fold paper or perform any of the small rituals she'd insisted carried significance beyond their apparent simplicity. I moved around the pit's circumference, gathering the offerings that had been left there, the ancient coins and carved stones and faded photographs, understanding now that these weren't random collections, but deliberate testimonies, evidence of lives touched and protected across generations beyond counting. Emma emerged from the tent, drawn by the sound of my voice, or perhaps by the same instinct that had called me, her gasp of shock transforming immediately into awed recognition as she saw the towering figure across from me, as though some part of her had always known this moment would come, and was simply relieved to finally stop pretending ignorance. She moved to my side without hesitation, taking my hand as she had countless times in childhood when we'd faced the world together, twin souls sharing courage. And together we began to arrange the objects according to patterns grandmother had drawn in her journal, creating a spiral that moved inward toward the buried figure, each artifact placed with intention and honor, acknowledging the individual stories they represented while weaving them into larger narrative of protection and sacrifice. The living creature watched our work with absolute stillness, presence so focused and intense I could feel its attention like weight upon my shoulders, not burden but blessing, approval flowing across the space between us as we honored the one who had chosen connection over isolation, who had loved humanity enough to become its silent guardian, even as that choice separated him from his own kind forever. Emma began speaking the old words without prompting, her memory proving sharper than mine, phrases flowing from her lips with natural ease, as though the language had simply been waiting for permission to emerge, dormant knowledge rising to surface when circumstances finally demanded its use. We worked in unison, movements synchronized without planning, twin instinct operating at levels deeper than conscious coordination, completing each other's intentions as we had since before birth, our shared presence forming something stronger than either of us alone could offer. The spiral of objects grew inward toward the center where the buried figure lay, each placement feeling like sentence in larger story, paragraph in longer testimony, chapter in book that encompassed centuries of watching and protecting, loving and losing, remaining faithful to covenant long after anyone remembered why such promises had been made or what they truly meant beyond the words themselves. When the spiral was complete, both the creature and I understood simultaneously that one final element remained, the piece that would close the ceremony and release what had been held in suspension, waiting for proper witness before accepting the finality of transition. The locket grandmother had left us, her final gift, heavy gold containing photographs that bridged the impossible distance between human and mystery, proof of love that transcended every boundary except death itself. I removed it from around my neck, where I'd worn it since finding it in the pit, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of all it represented, then placed it at the spiral's center directly above where the buried figure's heart would rest beneath earth and stone and accumulated time. The living creature moved then, circling the pit with steps so quiet they produced no sound despite its massive size, grace that seemed impossible in something so large until I understood that silence was its natural state, that moving through the world undetected was birthright rather than learned skill. It stopped between Emma and me, towering above us, and slowly extended one enormous hand palm upward in gesture that unmistakably requested ours, invitation to complete the ceremony through physical connection, joining the three of us. In acknowledgement that what bound us now was stronger than the separation death had imposed, that covenant continued across generations and species because some promises transcend the individuals who make them. Emma and I placed our hands in that massive palm, without hesitation, skin, meeting rough warmth that felt ancient beyond measure yet. Strangely familiar, as though we'd touched this same hand in dreams or distant memory or genetic inheritance that carried knowledge bones, remember even when minds forget. The creature closed its fingers around our hands with gentleness that contradicted its size, and together we stood at the pit's edge while I spoke the final words from Grandmother's journal, the blessing and release that honored sacrifice while acknowledging that all things must eventually return to earth, regardless of what they were or how they lived or who would mourn their passing. Power flowed through our joined hands, not supernatural but profound nonetheless, recognition that witness matters, that remembering is sacred act, that keeping covenant with mystery preserves something essential that dies when everything must be explained or proven or dragged into light, that destroys what it reveals. When I finished speaking, the creature released our hands and placed its palm against its chest, then extended it toward us in gesture that clearly meant gratitude, farewell, and promise simultaneously, acknowledgement that we had honored what was due and would be trusted with what came next. It turned away then, moving back into the forest with speed that seemed impossible, massive form dissolving into shadows, until I couldn't distinguish between creature and darkness, presence and absence, what I'd seen and what the forest had simply absorbed back into its keeping, leaving only the certainty that some encounters transform understanding so completely that returning to previous ignorance becomes impossible. That witness creates responsibility that outlasts the moment of revelation. We stayed at the burial site through the night, neither of us willing to leave until dawn broke over the hollow, transforming shadow into golden light that seemed to sanctify what we'd witnessed and completed in darkness. Emma and I didn't speak much during those hours, our silence companionable rather than uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between people who've shared something so profound that words would only diminish its significance by attempting to contain what language cannot hold. When we finally packed our tent and prepared to hike back toward Grandmother's cabin, I looked back at the pit one final time and saw that fresh wildflowers had appeared around its edge, blooms that hadn't been there when we'd completed the ceremony, as though the forest itself was adding its own tribute to what had been honored and released. We found Grandmother's final letter exactly where her journal had indicated it would be, tucked inside a hollow space beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, the envelope addressed to both our names in her careful handwriting that remained steady and clear despite the tremor that had affected her hands in her final years, as though writing these particular words had steadied something in her that age and illness couldn't touch. Her letter explained what we'd already begun to understand through experience, that our family's inheritance wasn't the cabin or the land or any material possession she could leave us, but rather the knowledge of what existed in these mountains and the responsibility to honor it through silence that protects rather than conceals, through witness that remembers without exploiting, through covenant that continues because some promises matter more than the individuals who make them. She wrote that she'd known since our childhood that we would be the ones to carry this forward, that the connection we shared as twins created something rare and necessary, a bond strong enough to hold mystery without needing to solve it, to encounter the impossible without demanding it become possible through explanation that would destroy what it touched. She taught us the old words deliberately, disguised as games and songs so we'd learn without questioning, preparing us for responsibility we couldn't understand until circumstances demanded we accept inheritance that came without instruction manual or guarantee of success, only faith that what had been passed through generations would continue. Because we chose to honor what came before, rather than insisting everything begin and end with our own understanding. The letter's final paragraph contained her blessing and her release. Permission to choose our own path forward, while acknowledging that once you've witnessed certain truths, returning to comfortable ignorance becomes impossible. Because transformation isn't something you can undo simply by wishing you'd never been changed. We spent the next 3 days at the cabin, reading through grandmother's journals more carefully, discovering layers of meaning we'd missed in our first hurried examination, patterns emerging that revealed decades of subtle guardianship and quiet intervention, protection offered and received across boundaries most people never knew existed. Emma found references to our own childhood, incidents we'd remembered as coincidence or luck, now revealed as moments when we'd been watched over by something that remained invisible but present, guardian inherited from generations past, who'd honored covenant by extending protection to those who carried the bloodline forward. We realized that the creature we'd encountered in the hollow wasn't the only one of its kind remaining in these mountains, that others still existed in places where wilderness ran deep enough to hide what chose to remain hidden, and that our family's responsibility extended beyond the single burial we'd honored to the larger obligation of keeping faith with mystery itself, refusing to betray what had trusted us with revelation. The understanding settled into my bones with weight that felt like purpose rather than burden, calling rather than obligation, gift disguised as responsibility, because some inheritances only reveal their true value when you've carried them long enough to understand what they preserve and protect and pass forward to whatever comes next. Returning to our ordinary lives proved impossible in ways I'd anticipated and others I hadn't. Not because anything supernatural followed us home, but because witness transforms the witness, because knowing certain truths exist changes how you move through a world that insists such things cannot be real. Emma and I made decisions together about what we'd tell others, which was nothing specific and everything essential, sharing grandmother's final wisdom that some legends don't need proof to be true, only witnesses willing to carry stories forward through generations that will face their own moments of choice about what to honor and what to dismiss as impossible. We returned to the cabin several times each year, hiking the paths grandmother walked, maintaining the old ways she taught us, placing our own offerings at sites marked in her journals while teaching our children the same songs and words she disguised as games, so they'll be ready when their time comes to stand at the edge of mystery and choose whether to honor what cannot be explained or demand that everything bend to understanding that destroys what it illuminates. I keep her final letter in the same locket that once held her photograph, wearing it close to my heart as reminder that the greatest inheritance isn't what we're given, but what we choose to protect and pass forward. That being keeper of mystery means guarding not just the secret itself, but the space where impossible things remain possible because someone refused to drag them into light that kills what it reveals. That some covenants continue forever because witnesses keep choosing to honor what came before while trusting that what comes next will do the same. What would you do if you inherited a secret too profound to share, but too important to forget? Subscribe to witness more mysteries that change those brave enough to seek them.